All right, so just the last couple of comments about imports coming into the U.S. So again, we import a lot of feeder cattle and a little bit of beef as well. So you guys can find some more information on this link here, and it's embedded in the PDF files of the lecture. And I want you guys to do just a short homework assignment for me and bring it in on Monday, February 5th to lecture. But basically, I want you to go to this link and really start to look at the information that is available about imports and exports and bring in just a half-page summary of U.S. beef trade. So, what does trade look like? What gets imported? What gets exported? And to who? And if possible, what are they importing and what are we exporting? And vice versa. So, this is a really intriguing figure that came out of an NCBA report. I just want to briefly look at this. This is looking at imports of feeder cattle both from Canada and Mexico. So we've got the Canadian imports over here to the left, and the way that these bars break down is that um, they are broke down by state. So Washington, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, as well as a few other states. And then the blue bar is the total. Um, so we can see that there's a lot of cattle actually coming in through North Dakota. That makes sense if you look just north of North Dakota. That is the central part of Canada, so a lot of cattle in that country. And these are going to be represented by years. So starting at 2002 up here and 2016 down here. So you can see our total imports from Canada were really, really high in 2008, 2009. And that was because Canada and us to an extent was really recovering from the cow that stole Christmas on December 23rd, 2003, where it was detected that there was a bovine somatotropin, or not bovine somatotropin, bo- um, BSE, so bovine spongiform encephalopathy case in a dairy cow in Moses Lake, Washington, at the packing house there, and it was actually from Canada. And since there was a high incidence of BSE all over the world, there were hard trade restrictions put in place on the U.S. and Canada. And then on the Mexican side, you can see if the pink line is the total Mexican imports. We imported a lot of cattle 2003, 2004, 2006. Mexico was in severe drought at that point in time, so they were trying to offload what they had. And then you can sort of see where we started having major recession issues 2008 2009, so total imports were down at that point in time and picked back up. So the Mexican um, imports are pretty consistent. You can see we actually have a really strong cycle here with the Mexican imports. So and just as a side note, the Mexican numbers here are split up by state, but only Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. So California has no imports, and that's because we don't cross a ton of cattle at the Mexicali crossing station. So a lot of those cattle actually come up through the Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona crossing stations. And but all of those cattle don't necessarily stay in those states. If they're coming through Texas and New Mexico, and they're heavy cattle, like 900 or 1,000 pounds, they're going straight to feed yards in the panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And if they are lighter weight cattle, like weaned cattle or 600 weight cattle, then they're going to northern Arizona, or the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas in California if it's during the summer. So they'll grow on two seasons of grass: summer grass and fall, winter, and spring grass. And so those cattle eventually come back to California. Um, in on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas in the Bridgeport area, that's big stalker country. That valley will run 10,000 head of stalkers during the summer, and then those cattle usually come back over to the Sacramento Valley and San Joaquin valleys and graze on rangeland through April or May and then go into a feed yard. All right, so I had mentioned the cattle cycle there. This is a really important concept for you guys to be aware of um, because the cattle cycle helps make the business of being in the beef industry doable. So it's predictable. So Harlan Hughes, who passed away last year, he's a longtime beef industry economics writer, and he said that in 2016 that after we had come off of a price pattern that was not linked to the cattle cycle, that bearing major future shocks such as droughts or national economy setbacks, to just name two, beef producers are facing finally another cattle cycle in the beef industry. So we had severe drought from 2012 really through 2015, as you guys know, and that really decreased the total numbers, not just in the West, but across the nation as well. And so that drove prices up, both on feeder, fed cattle, and our commodities to unprecedented levels. So they were extremely high. Just to give you guys um, a little bit of a little bit of background, we saw that on the first day of class that fed cattle were selling at 120 a hundredweight. Fed cattle in 2014 during this same time period were probably selling for up around $2 or $200 per hundredweight. Um, so that price pattern for that year of 2014 and part of 2015 was uncharacteristic of the cattle cycle. So it was new territory for the beef industry, and we didn't know what was going to happen, honestly. So we're very excited to be back to a normal cattle cycle now. So the cattle cycle, if we look over time, is related to the prices, both on the live and on the commodity market. And if you look at our history from 1974-75 clear through 2015, 2016, 2017, there are, of course, ups and downs, so hills and valleys to this pricing pattern, but it is a pattern, so it's a known cycle. And usually the cycle is about 11 years in length. So when we look at that 11-year cycle, it really ends up being a function of supply and demand. And that cycle was really set in place because of the generation interval in cattle. So cattle have a long gestation length. It takes quite a bit of time for that animal to actually get into the system, get into the cattle cycle, and complete the cycle. So as that process happens, it really sets this 11-year cattle cycle. So the cattle cycle really started being defined in 1975. That's where we can trace roots back to. And at that point in time, we had 135 million head of cattle here in the U.S. And that is a really high number. That was one of the highest numbers ever. So, but at that time in 75, we had extreme drought, major economic things going on from a political standpoint. We were at the end of the Vietnam War, and so all of those things coupled together resulted in a crash. So that crash really resulted in high cattle numbers because there wasn't a big supply of cattle. So you can just think about that as we talk about the cattle cycle. If prices are high, cattle numbers are low. If prices are low, cattle numbers are high. So it really is based on the supply and demand curve. So one thing to just keep in mind here is as we look at these prices, we're a little less than a million head. We're at 91 million head of cattle currently, so this number is a little bit off. But we're still producing the same amount of beef as we were in the 70s with 135 million head of cattle. So I want you guys to think about that a little bit and why does and why do we produce the same amount of beef today that we did in the 70s with 25% of the numbers? And that really goes back to our efficiency. So we've become more efficient with cattle. They're spending less days on feed. We have less cost associated with them, and they're producing more total pounds of retail product. So our efficiency has gotten much better since 40 years ago. All right. So as we look at the cattle numbers again, this is just kind of putting on a slide what I just talked about. So we're seeing an increase in total production today compared to 40 years ago because we've been able to increase carcass weight. So mean carcass weights across the country in 1970 was 613 pounds on the rail. And today it's up around 822 pounds. I actually think I saw the 2016 numbers, and I believe they're even higher. I think it's around 830 pounds for 2016. So you can see from 1970 to 1991 to 2004 and 2014, we're slowly increasing carcass yield. Um, I think that we're going to get to a point that we max that out. We're already starting to see that, and it's really starting to produce some inconsistencies because we've got, the more we push towards bigger cattle numbers, the more variation in total numbers we actually see on the rails. So I think we're approaching the end of the curve on carcass weights. So just keep in mind that the reasons that we actually produce more total pounds of um, of retail product today compared to the 70s. Again, it goes back to our efficiency. So feedlot turnover has increased from turning an entire population in the feedlot over um, twice a year to 2.4 times a year. So our feed efficiency is better, days on feed are less. And we're also slaughtering cattle at a decreased age compared to the 1970s. So average slaughter age in the 70s was 24 months of age, and now we're to about 13 months of age on average. And again, genetics. So we've really focused on improving genetics and breeding cattle that can actually take on more weight. And a lot of that comes from increased incidence of crossbreeding as well. So, and then one last note here, we've also increased the total pounds of beef per cow that per cow in the herd or in the breeding herd. So each individual cow is individually producing more total pounds at weaning, and that offspring is producing more total pounds at um, at slaughter as well.